Okinawa, April 1945. To the men who stepped onto that island, it felt less like a battlefield and more like a descent into the underworld. The Battle of Okinawa was supposed to be the final stepping stone before the invasion of the Japanese mainland. But beneath the surface of the island, hidden from reconnaissance planes and naval bombardment, the Imperial Japanese Army had constructed something the Americans had never before encountered on such a scale. A fortress city built underground. The Americans knew tunnels existed. They did not know they stretched for miles, connected command posts, hospitals, ammunition chambers, and concealed tens of thousands of soldiers who could vanish into the earth and reappear behind American lines. To Marines and Army infantry who advanced across Okinawa, the ground itself became the enemy. This audiobook-like narrative begins at the moment American forces realized that the battle above was only half the war. The island that wasn't what it seemed. At first glance, Okinawa looked peaceful compared to volcanic Iwo Jima. Green hills, terraced farmland, stone walls, small villages, nothing suggested the nightmare hidden below. But beneath those gentle hills lay the Shuri Line, the most elaborate defensive tunnel system ever built in the Pacific War. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief strategist, General Isamu Cho, understood that Japan could not defeat American firepower in open combat. Instead, they turned the island into something closer to a medieval fortress. By 1945, Okinawa was honeycombed with tunnels dug by hand, interconnected caves, natural limestone chambers reinforced with timber, false entranceways, ventilation shafts camouflaged as rocks, hidden artillery positions that fired, vanished, and reappeared miles away. The underground headquarters at Shuri Castle itself extended into the bedrock, a city beneath a city. April 1st, the day the island stayed silent. When the Americans landed on April 1st, 1945, they were stunned. There was no resistance, no machine gun fire, no artillery, no counterattack, just eerie silence. Intelligence officers celebrated prematurely. Some believed the Japanese had evacuated the southern half of the island. Others imagined the enemy was saving forces for a final stand later. They were all wrong. General Cho watched the landings from his periscope hidden deep inside the tunnel network. His staff officers stood beside him under flickering lanterns. When asked if the Americans should be engaged, Cho famously replied, "Let them come. The deeper they come, the fewer will return." The ground swallowed the Japanese army whole. The first clues, something was wrong. American soldiers began to notice strange details. Dead villages with food still on tables, tools left on the ground as if people vanished mid-task, animals roaming freely. And the most disturbing sign, no bodies. Every Japanese defender had gone underground. Patrols approached hills that aerial reconnaissance identified as empty. Suddenly, the hills exploded with fire. Mortar shells, machine guns, and grenades raining down from invisible positions. Marines charged forward, expecting trenches. Instead, they found nothing but rock. Then, without warning, Japanese soldiers appeared from holes no wider than a backpack, firing rifles at point-blank range before disappearing again. The Americans had entered a battlefield where the enemy controlled every shadow. Inside the tunnels, a world without sunlight. The Japanese tunnel cities were cruel, suffocating environments. Humidity reached 98%. Water dripped constantly from the limestone. The air reeked of sweat, fumes, and corpses. Wounded soldiers were stacked along walls in near darkness, tended by medics who worked by candlelight. Some chambers served as headquarters, others as artillery stations. Nurses pushed stretchers through narrow passageways barely 3 feet high. One nurse later wrote, "We forgot the sun existed. We lived like ghosts under the ground." The Americans never imagined they would have to fight an enemy who could sleep, eat, reload, and move entire battalions beneath their feet. The first tunnel battles. When Marines assaulted the southern defenses for the first time, they expected resistance, but not this. They captured a ridgeline after 9 hours of brutal fighting. As they dug in for the night, Japanese soldiers emerged from behind them, cutting through units that believed they were safely in American-held territory. Engineers discovered a hidden tunnel entrance masked by a pile of rocks. When they entered, flamethrower teams found passages branching in multiple directions, some leading deeper, others rising toward unseen firing ports. Every chamber became a miniature battlefield. One officer wrote in his diary, "We were not fighting men, we were fighting the mountain itself."
Why the tunnels terrified both sides for Americans. The horror came from the invisibility of the enemy. For Japanese soldiers, the terror came from what happened when Americans finally sealed the tunnels. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, bulldozers pushing earth into ventilation shafts, explosives detonated at tunnel mouths, collapsing entire sections with hundreds inside. Many Japanese defenders preferred suicide to being burned alive or buried in darkness. Grenades echoed through the tunnel maze day and night. A Japanese surgeon wrote, "We operated while explosions shook earth above us. Dust rained from the ceiling. Sometimes the wounded begged us to kill them before the fire reached us." The turning point, when both sides realized the truth by late April. Both armies understood a chilling reality. The battle for Okinawa would be decided underground. American firepower ruled the skies and seas. Japanese resilience ruled the tunnels. Neither side could easily reach the other, so they began a new type of combat. Tunnel warfare, the likes of which neither army had trained for. Marines crawled into darkness with only a flashlight and a .45 pistol. Japanese soldiers waited silently in branching chambers, unable to risk gunfire that would give away their position. The tunnels created a world where fear traveled faster than bullets. By the third week of April 1945, American commanders finally grasped the scale of the underground empire beneath Okinawa. The Shuri Line was not a series of defensive pockets. It was a single living organism, a fortress distributed through stone. Every cave, every ventilation shaft, every firing slit was part of a larger body that seemed impossible to kill. The Marines advancing southward felt as though they were cutting into something that could sense every movement and respond instantly. The Japanese defenders rarely exposed themselves unless the advantage was overwhelming. Instead, they watched, they waited, and then, when darkness fell, the tunnels awakened. American troops described nights on Okinawa as being stalked by something unseen. A hill taken during the day would erupt with gunfire from behind at dawn. A cave sealed with explosives would mysteriously open from another entrance. Positions thought secure suddenly became death traps. Some Marines swore they heard voices echoing from below. The low rumble of boots whispered commands. Scraping tools like an ant colony shifting just beneath their feet. To the 1st Marine Division, the worst were the breathing hills. Engineers discovered that a single ridgeline might contain 19, sometimes 20 interconnected chambers, each linked by shafts carved by pickaxe. When flamethrowers blasted one opening, hot air would rush out of another whole 60 yards away. It felt like the mountain was exhaling. American intelligence soon identified the mastermind behind this system. General Mitsuru Oshijima's chief of staff, Isamu Cho, and the engineer officers who had studied tunnel warfare in Manchuria. Their goal was not to win an open battle, it was to slow, bleed, and psychologically exhaust the Americans until an invasion of mainland Japan became too costly to contemplate. The deeper the Americans advanced, the more the terrain seemed designed to break them. Rain turned the hills into rivers of mud. Leeches dropped from trees. Artillery fire never stopped. Each attack required crawling uphill under machine gun fire that came from holes invisible, until they flashed. For Japanese soldiers, life inside the tunnels was worsening. The air grew stale, heavy with unwashed bodies and kerosene lamps. Water shortages forced men to lick condensation from walls. Medical chambers overflowed with wounded who lay shoulder to shoulder in near darkness, listening for the next explosion that might seal them in forever. Yet despite these miseries, Japanese morale hardened. Underground, they felt protected by the island itself. Above ground, the Americans were learning the cost of fighting an enemy embedded inside stone. The 96th Infantry Division captured a hill after 14 hours of brutal combat. only to discover the tunnels allowed Japanese troops to reoccupy the same position by nightfall. "We never owned anything," one soldier wrote. "We only rented ground by the hour." The Americans adapted. Flamethrower teams from the 713th Flame Tank Battalion began to dominate the field. The M4A3 Zippo Shermans could project streams of burning fuel over 100 yards, flooding cave mouths with fire and sucking oxygen out of chambers where defenders hid. Infantry followed with satchel charges, 20-pound bundles of TNT thrown like bowling balls into holes that belched smoke. The shockwaves collapsed ceilings, buried defenders, and permanently sealed tunnels. For Japanese soldiers, being entombed alive became a more feared fate than death in battle. Yet even these methods often fail. Many tunnel systems had multiple exits. Seal one entrance and another would open. Collapse a shaft and air pockets allowed survivors to wait days before counterattacking. The Americans felt as if they were fighting phantoms. By late April, the struggle reached its climax around the ridges of Shuri, a natural fortress whose limestone slopes hid the deepest tunnels. The approach was a nightmare: steep inclines soaked with rain, machine gun nests in caves that had to be attacked one at a time, and artillery that struck with uncanny precision. Observers guiding the Japanese guns sat safely underground, invisible to aircraft, impossible to silence. One Marine officer described the battlefield as a world of holes, holes that spat fire, holes that swallowed men, holes that screamed when hit with flame. The sheer density of defensive points meant that every 100 yards cost dozens of lives. Inside the tunnels, Japanese commanders wrestled with a different terror suffocation. As American bombardment intensified, smoke and dust rolled through chambers with nowhere to escape. Lanterns flickered out. Soldiers covered their mouths with cloth, gasping for air. Medical officers recorded men dying not from wounds but from lack of oxygen as fires raged outside. The Japanese counterattacked from underground, emerging abruptly behind American lines through escape shafts carved into slopes. Patrols vanished into blackness when investigating new entrances. At night, infiltrators crawled through brush to cut phone lines, steal ammunition, and kill isolated Marines before slipping back into tunnels. American frustration peaked as the casualty lists grew. Okinawa had become the bloodiest Pacific campaign, and the tunnels were the reason why. "We weren't fighting soldiers," one G wrote. "We were fighting geology." Still, the Americans pressed forward inch by inch. The turning point came when engineers developed new tactics, sealing entire tunnel ridges by detonating explosives in sequence, causing massive collapses that buried chambers by the dozens. Bulldozers pushed soil over vents, starving defenders of air. Combat patrols surrounded known networks and attacked simultaneously from every direction, preventing escape. In early May, the Shuri line finally began to crack. Japanese food stores ran out. Water rationing dropped to mere sips per day. Ammunition dwindled until some soldiers carried only grenades. The once mighty tunnel fortress, after weeks of bombardment and starvation, was dying from within. Yet the defenders fought on. One American captain later wrote, "They did not fear us. They feared the tunnels collapsing above them. They feared silence more than gunfire." As May bled into June, both armies understood that the final act of the tunnel war would be fought not for victory, but for survival. By late May 1945, the tunnels beneath Okinawa were no longer a secret weapon. They were a suffocating trap that both sides feared. For American soldiers and Marines, every new ridgeline meant starting the same nightmare again. First came the artillery preparation, hours of pounding from battleships and cruisers offshore, the thunder of 155mm howitzers, the shriek of rockets. Hills disappeared in dust and smoke, their outlines erased by explosions so constant that men shouted into each other's ears, and still could barely hear. Then the bombardment stopped. Silence settled over the shattered landscape. Infantry squads rose from muddy foxholes and began to climb. They moved cautiously, senses strained, eyes searching for any sign of movement in the collapsed rock and twisted vegetation. Almost always, the same pattern returned. A crack of a rifle shot from nowhere. A burst of light from a black hole in the hillside. Machine gun fire stitching across the slope. Mortar shells falling from unseen positions. The tunnels were still alive. Some Americans compared it to fighting ghosts. You could pour thousands of shells into a rage, send in flamethrowers and satchel charges, even blow entire sections of hillside apart. and still Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden exits that no one had seen before. The tunnel systems were not just dug straight into the face of hills but angled, twisted, and layered. Bent shafts rose behind ridgelines. Communication galleries ran parallel to the front line. A cave that seemed isolated might actually be just one node in a network stretching hundreds of meters underground. For the Japanese defenders inside, the world had shrunk to rock darkness and the sound of distant thunder. Food rations had dwindled to handfuls of rice. Some days there was nothing to eat at all. Water came from cisterns or seeped slowly down limestone walls. Men caught droplets on their tongues. The air grew foul. Lanterns burned low to save fuel. Smoke from cooking fires had to be vented through hidden shafts, but artillery blasts sometimes collapsed those exits, forcing entire units to sit in choking fumes. Wounded soldiers lay on bare rock or on thin mats, stacked so close together that medics had to step over them. Many had gangrenous limbs that could not be amputated because there were no supplies. They smelled their own bodies rotting. The sound of artillery overhead never stopped. Dust sifted from ceilings with each impact. Every concussion brought the same thought: maybe this one will be the one that buries us alive. And yet, orders did not change. Hold, delay, bleed the Americans. On the surface, American engineers intensified their assault on the underground fortress. Bulldozers pushed debris into cave mouths, forming plugs of dirt and rock. Combat engineers drilled holes into slopes and packed them with explosives, triggering massive blasts that caved in entire chambers. Flamethrower tanks rolled forward under infantry protection, hissing jets of fire into any opening large enough to admit the nozzle. In some places, the two sides were separated only by inches of rock. American demolition teams would hear voices on the other side of a wall. Japanese soldiers listened to Americans talking just beyond the tunnel mouth. Sometimes both sides fired blindly through cracks, neither able to see the other, only guessing at their enemy's position from the sound. One Marine later recalled sitting on a slope at dusk staring at a hillside that had been burned, blasted, and bulldozed for 3 days. Smoke still leaked from a dozen blackened holes. There can't be anything left alive in there, he told the man next to him. An hour later, tracer fire erupted from one of the caves and 2 men from his squad went down. The hill was still killing them. The stress ate at everyone. American units began to talk about bad hills with a kind of superstition, as if the ground itself were haunted. Some men refused to sleep above a captured cave system, afraid that the Japanese would blow it from underneath. Others developed an instinctive panic at the sight of a black hole in the earth, no matter how small. Foxholes dug too close to old cave entrances felt cursed. The Japanese carried their own fears. They had always been taught that surrender was unthinkable, that death in battle was honorable, that to die for the emperor was the highest calling. But nothing in their training had prepared them for the slow, suffocating collapse of a tunnel system under siege. To die in a banzai charge, facing the enemy with the bayonet in hand, was one thing. To die buried, alone in the dark, was another. Some chose to avoid that fate. When flamethrower fuel poured into their chambers and the temperature rose in seconds, soldiers sometimes pulled the pins on grenades and clutched them to their chests. Others shot themselves as smoke thickened, preferring a known death to the uncertain horror of suffocation. Officers often went last, walking through their dimly lit galleries to ensure that no one tried to crawl toward American lines to surrender. By late May, General Ashijima and General Cho knew the battle for the Shuri line was lost. Reports from forward positions spoke of ammunition nearly exhausted, of companies reduced to a few dozen men, of units that existed only on paper. American artillery and naval gunfire had turned the surface of southern Okinawa into a moonscape. Rain filled shell holes and washed down slopes, flooding some tunnels and cutting others off entirely. Japanese headquarters itself operated from an underground complex carved into the hills, near Shuri Castle. Staff officers worked in cramped chambers lit by lanterns, charts spread across makeshift tables. Messages arrived from fronts that no longer existed. Telephone lines failed and were never repaired. The map on the wall still showed regiment and battalion markers, but everyone in the room understood that many of those units were gone. On May 29th, under relentless American pressure, Japanese forces began to withdraw from the Shuri line toward the southern tip of the island. The retreat did not look like any organized maneuver. It was scattered, chaotic, and desperate. Some remnants of units moved through pre-dug escape tunnels, emerging miles to the rear. Others crawled through darkness alone, following faint drafts of air until they reached openings on cliffs or in ravines. For American troops advancing into abandoned positions, the experience was uncanny. They walked into cave mouths that had been fought over for weeks, and found them empty, rifles stacked neatly, shell casings swept into corners, handwritten orders pinned to the walls. It felt as if the defenders had simply dissolved into the rock. But the battle was not over. The final Japanese stand would take place in the southernmost part of the island, an area of steep ravines and limestone bluffs above the sea. Here, the tunnel war took on an even more tragic dimension, because civilians were trapped in the same underground labyrinth as soldiers. Okinawan families had sought shelter in caves since the first bombardments. Some had been forced inside by Japanese troops. Others had gone underground on their own, believing rock would protect them from shells. They brought children, elderly, whatever food they could carry. As the front moved south, more civilians were driven into ever smaller pockets of ground, often sharing chambers with wounded soldiers and doctors who had no medicine left. For Marines and soldiers advancing through this maze, every cave became an agonizing question. Was it a firing point, a command post, a hospital, a civilian refuge? The only way to know was to get close enough to look, and getting close meant stepping into range of whatever waited in the dark. American units began using loudspeakers and interpreters to call into caves before attacking, pleading for civilians to come out. Sometimes terrified families emerged, hands raised, pushing children ahead of them. Sometimes machine gun fire answered instead. The same rocky mouth could conceal both women clutching infants and men holding grenades. The tunnels that had terrified American soldiers as an invulnerable military system now terrified them as a moral trap. Every decision carried the risk of killing people they could not see. Some officers ordered flamethrowers used only on confirmed firing positions. Others, facing heavy casualties and tight schedules, took no chances and treated every hole as hostile. Years later, many veterans would remember this part of the campaign with the most pain. Inside headquarters, Generals Ushijima and Cho held their final conferences. They had fulfilled the orders given to them: delay the Americans as long as possible, inflict maximum casualties, force the enemy to pay dearly for every mile. They had hoped, perhaps privately, that the scale of American losses on Okinawa might persuade Washington to negotiate, or at least to reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. Whether that hope had any basis in reality no longer mattered. The battle was over. On the night of June 21, 1945, as American units closed in, Ushijima and Cho left their underground command post and climbed a slope overlooking the sea. Artillery flashes still lit the horizon. The air smelled of smoke and salt. They wore full-dress uniforms. Staff officers accompanied them part of the way, then remained behind as ordered. Ushijima faced the ocean and boat toward the Imperial Palace far to the north. Then, according to surviving accounts, he and Cho committed ritual suicide, each assisted by trusted aides. Their bodies were later found near the entrance to the tunnel system they had used to conduct the battle. For the Americans, news of their deaths barely registered at first. There were still caves to clear, ridges to scale, patrols to send into ravines that had swallowed men the day before. The tunnel war did not end with a single ceremony. It ended piecemeal, as one position after another fell silent. In the weeks after organized resistance ceased, American engineers continued to deal with the underground threat. They mapped captured tunnel systems, blew charges in remaining entrances, and posted warnings around areas suspected of containing unexploded ordnance or sealed chambers full of munitions. Some caves were left undisturbed, their contents unknown. The island remained pockmarked with scars, collapsed galleries, blocked shafts, the skeletons of fortresses no longer needed. For the men who had fought there, the memory of Okinawa was not just of gunfire and explosions, but of darkness. The darkness inside the hills, the darkness of not knowing what waited behind a black opening, the darkness of choices made under extreme pressure. Many spoke later of dreams in which they were back on those slopes, staring into caves, unable to move and knowing something was about to emerge. Japanese survivors of the tunnel system carried their own nightmares. Some had escaped through exit shafts in the chaos of the final days. Others had been captured when their positions were finally overrun. They remembered comrades weakened by starvation, officers insisting on final charges up stairways carved into rock, wounded men begging to be left with grenades. The echoes of blasts in confined spaces, the feeling of the earth shaking above and below, stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Strategically, the tunnel battle under Okinawa revealed horrifying truths to both sides. To American planners, it demonstrated that if this was what a single island defense looked like, an invasion of mainland Japan would be a bloodbath on an unimaginable scale. They began calculating casualty estimates not in thousands, but in hundreds of thousands. The vision of millions of soldiers and civilians fighting in city basements, mountain tunnels, and underground bunkers drove home a simple conclusion: Japan would not surrender easily, and its leaders were willing to sacrifice entire populations rather than yield. To Japanese officers who studied the battle afterward, the tunnels were both a source of pride and a symbol of futility. They had allowed the garrison to hold out far longer than anyone expected, and to inflict terrible casualties, but they had not changed the outcome. No matter how well the tunnels were designed, no matter how bravely the defenders fought, air and sea power still encircled the island. American logistics still flowed uninterrupted. Artillery shells still arrived by the tens of thousands. Tunnels could delay defeat, but they could not reverse it. In that sense, the tunnel war beneath Okinawa terrified both sides for the same underlying reason. It revealed a world where courage alone was no longer enough. The Japanese defenders learned that even the most fanatical determination could not overcome industrial and logistical inferiority. The Americans learned that even overwhelming material superiority could not make victory painless, that an enemy prepared to fight in the dark underground to the last man could turn every hill into a slaughterhouse. When veterans of Okinawa spoke decades later, they rarely mentioned grand strategy. They talked about rocks, mud, rain, and holes in the earth. They talked about the smell of burned limestone after a flamethrower blast, the sound of shovels digging somewhere below, the sight of a tunnel entrance that looked exactly like 100 others, except this one would decide who lived or died that day. The secret tunnel battle beneath Okinawa did not end with a single decisive moment. It ended with exhausted men on both sides crawling out of the ground, blinking in the light, realizing that the island, and perhaps the war itself, had taken more than anyone had imagined when the first tunnels were dug. It left behind a lesson written not on maps or in orders, but in stone, that when war goes underground, when mountains themselves become weapons, there are no easy victories, only survivors who carry the darkness with them, long after the guns fall silent.